Alright, welcome back. So in our last video, we set up all the scaffolding that we're going to need to now put together our recycler adapter and our data. So we are going to now start wiring those pieces together. Now the logic of that needs to go into our main activity fragment, because that's the whole purpose of this fragment, is to take that recycler view and show it to the user. So we're going to add a couple of pieces here for us to work with. We're going to want some variables. For example, I'm going to want access to my recycler view itself. I'm just going to call it recycler view. We're going to need an adapter that we just made. So we called that user recycler view adapter. I'm just going to call it adapter. And then since we're dealing with a layout manager, we're going to also need a private integer of column count, is what we typically call it. This is where we can provide some flexibility. You know, that value could be set dynamically, so if you only had one column or multiple columns, you know, to switch between, say, a linear or a grid, other pieces like that, a column count is a useful place to be able to do that. And I'll show you how that would come into play here in a little bit. But now we want to do these big pieces here. So when we create our view, we want to, as we've done in the past, store a reference to our, not our recycler view. We are going to actually hold off on that return for a minute. I'm going to create a, let's call it a root. Let's do what we've done in the past, actually. That's better. So let's create ourselves a private view root. Okay, and we'll assign that root. We'll come down here before I forget and add a return to root. Okay, but we want to do a few more things when we create this view. Specifically, when we create the view now, I want to get a reference to my adapter. So as what I want to do is, or not my adapter, my recycler view. So let's get that, and let's go ahead and find that. So we are going to return a recycler view from root.findViewById, r.id.recycler. What did we call that guy? Let's go to our fragment. Oh, we called it RV user list. That's why I can't find it. RV user list. Okay, let's find and access the recycler view that we want to be able to work with. Okay, so this will allow us to have access now to our recycler that we need to work with, and then now we need to set up and tell the recycler to work with all of our data. Now, sometimes programmers will put all of this in the onCreateView, but what tends to happen then is we put a lot of this logic in onCreateView, is we tend to bog down that piece of the lifecycle unnecessarily. So I think this is a better place for us to do an override here. So let's go to generate, override a method, and let's do on resume. Come on, resume. Apparently I can't spell today. This is ridiculous. On resume, there it is. Okay, inside of our on resume now, let's put all of this together. So we're going to need a couple of things for us to hold on to. We're going to need a context to work with later, so I'm going to call this context. And we'll say get context. Okay. We have our recycler view we already need to work with. Now let's go ahead and populate our adapter. So our adapter equals new user recycler view adapter, which then took a list. In this case, let's just give it a new blank array list. Okay, it doesn't need to have anything in it for now, because we're going to pass that data in out of our database. You know, to pass our interface connection, we would pass that back here as well. There's a method, there's an argument when we do that here in a little bit. Okay, and here's where you can use that column count to set a linear layout manager if you want to change. For example, you would do something if column count is less than or equal to 1, then our recycler view, let's set the layout manager as a new linear layout manager. Oops. Recycler view dot set layout manager new grid and let's column count. Okay, so that way you can have now. This is where we start to bring in this idea again now of having reusable fragments. So if this fragment could be used on a, say, a phone, I only want to show one column. Maybe if I'm on a tablet though, I want to show 2 or 3 columns. And then I can now do all of that in the fragment dynamically and just have this value column count be set differently based on the size rather than having a hard-coded one as we have now. That could be changed using techniques we've looked at in the past. But the heart of this thing now is we need to have our recycler view. It needs to be told to use that adapter we just constructed. So we call set adapter and pass it an instance of that adapter. Okay. Also important here is our recycler view. We want to set has fixed size to false, because what has fixed size means is the length of our adapter is never going to change. So if I set that to true, it'll never want to go and show us new stuff as I add it. So we're going to set that to false so that our adapter now can, its length, its count will be dynamic based on the data that it's working with. It's not a fixed size of data, it's a variable size of data. So now we have a recycler view and our recycler view adapter coupled together. What we need to now do is give it data to work with. And this is where that view model now is going to come into play. So how do I take the data that a view model is going to hold and couple it now to my recycler adapter? That way that view model can do its job of being life cycle agnostic. Okay, so we access this through view model providers. Specifically, I'm going to look for the providers of this fragment that I'm in. So give me every view model that's attached to this guy. Specifically, I want to get, and I need to now give it the class that I'm working with. So what did I call my view model? In this case, we called our view model all users view model. So give me the access to that class. So I want to get the view model of the instance that belongs to this fragment. Okay. Now within the appropriate instance of this model, I want to call the method. Specifically, I want to call my getUserList, which again I had to pass it my context because the database needed that. So give me a user list. But because that user list, if we go back in a little bit, okay, this user list, if we go back to our view model, returns a live data object. So we need to interact with that live data. So rather than just working with it in a fixed way, maybe storing it as I would it with some other piece of data that's not live, I want to observe changes. My lifecycle owner, so whose lifecycle events does this observation need to be tied to? For example, if this goes into the on-stop state, don't tell me about changes because I ain't going to do anything with them. But if I'm running, if my fragment is on screen and running and visible, then I need to know those changes. So the lifecycle owner will allow the live data class as an observer to manage whether I'm calling methods appropriately or not. Okay, so we have our owner, and now we need to create then a new observer. So this is the same type idea as an on-click event listener, any other type of listener. An observer is a class that has a single method called onChanged. So when observed notes a change, it will call onChanged and says, okay, what do you want me to do with the change? Okay, so in our case, I want to say as long as that list of users that's coming to me as an argument here, because again, that's what I'm observing based on the return type of my user list. So if my users exist, i.e. it's not null, then my adapter needs to be told about it. So we're gonna add a new method here called addItems, and we'll pass it that user's list. Okay. Right now it complains, it says, hey, addItems doesn't exist. Well, If I Alt-Enter, I can say, well, go make it for me. And I'll now have my add items method. Now, add items is going to be a pretty simple idea. This method now needs to take the data that we just got and store it in our list of users that we have up here. Okay. Now, because we don't know what changed, maybe something got added, something got removed, it's good practice to say users dot clear, get rid of everything, then dot add all of our new data set that just came in. And then lastly, we need to tell the recycler view that things have changed. So there's a method we call said notify data set changed. And what this will do is say, hey, recycler view, our data set has changed. You need to react to it. And so then the recycler view will call get count and see if the count has changed. It will then re-render all of the pieces that are on screen at this point in time. Now, as you get into more advanced use cases, which is outside the scope of where we can go in this class, you can choose to invalidate individual pieces as we know what has changed, rather than invalidating the whole list. But again, out of a desire to just get you up and running and get the big concepts, we're going to just go ahead and invalidate the entire data set, which is fine with a small data set, but when you get out in the real world, as I said, with large data sets, you're going to want to be a little bit more efficient than that. But we want to get you up and functioning for now. So now I have my fragment is able to observe my view model and observe changes to my database and then render those pieces in place. So if I run my application though, okay, as always, when I push run, what should I expect to see? So I want you to think about that. While this Gradle build is taking a long time to run, what do I expect to see when this thing pops up on my screen here in just a few minutes? Hey, it's finally done. Now, if your answer was nothing, you're right. Okay. Now, why are we seeing nothing on here? Short answer, there's nothing in the database, right? Now, yours may have had something if you actually still had data in your version of this project. I've uninstalled it since. So I don't have any data to work with, you know. So we need to be able to add data. Just for simplicity's sake to get this demo going, what I'm going to do here is in my floating action button, rather than having my snack bar take place here, I'm going to just insert a little bit of dummy data for us so we can see something working for now. So we can see that a recycler view is working. We'll want to do that in a dialog box here in a little bit, but for now, let's just go ahead and get our floating action button to just put a little bit of data in there. So as we did last time, let's just throw up a new thread. Okay, because we can't do any of this on the main UI thread. So we have a new thread, accepts a runnable, with a method called run, and then we'll go ahead and start it. Our method run simply needs to just get access to our app database, get instance of it, give us the application context. Let's get our user DAO and called insert. In fact, why don't we, if we're going to do this, let's go user u equals new user. And in our user, what did we define as constructors? We have one that takes first name, one that takes last name, or we can take one that does everything here. I'm going to modify this guy to take an email address since we needed both of those to string email. And do this dot email equals email. So now we'll create an instance of a user that contains a first name, Josh, last name, Jensen, and an email address. Okay, And let's just go ahead and throw that guy in the database. So throw our user in there. So now when we run our application, we'll be able to click on that button, which has an email icon. We'll want to change that as well here in a minute. And I'll show you how to do that as well to make things look pretty, but we want to be able to see that our recycler view is working the way we expect it to be working. So we're going to let our Gradle build run, and our application is back up and running now. So we can click our button. Uh-oh, and we have a problem. Alright, after a little bit of debugging, I realized where my issue is here. You're going to laugh. It's kind of a fun thing to find. It's what I get for changing names of variables in my sample. If you notice in our recycler view adapter, when we made our add items, we took our argument and called it users. This also happens to be the name of the variable we called in our recycler view adapter. So when I'm calling users.clear, I'm not calling it on the field, I'm calling it on the argument. So what we need to do is this.users.clear and this.users.addAll to our argument users. Made me feel very sheepish, but I think that should solve our problem. So let's go ahead and run this sucker again. Let's get it building. And huzzah, we have a list of items. And as we continue, I can click it, and you'll notice new ones just add on, and now I can scroll through those. Now, it would be nice if it wasn't adding just the same person every time. So in our next video, we're going to talk about how to set up a full screen dialog, because that's the material design aspect when we're creating something like this, is how do we do a full screen dialog rather than just a small dialog box to allow us to create a new user for us to work with. Okay, we'll see you in the next video.